All right, well, let's go ahead and get started, and we will likely have more continuing to join. But for those of you who are here, welcome, and we're glad to have you with us. And if you are watching this recording later after the fact, we're also glad to have you here. My name is Meg Smeltzer Miller, and I am Finance Officer at Menno Media and its book imprint, Herald Press. This webinar is part of our CommonRead series. The CommonRead series is a partnership between Mennonite Church USA, Mennonite Church Canada, and Herald Press, in which we are encouraging Mennonites and Anabaptists to read carefully selected books that are chosen to equip the church in our life and our faith during this time. So today I want to welcome author Carlene Hill Byron. Her book, Not Quite Fine, Mental Health, Faith, and Showing Up for One Another is the focus of today's conversation. So I will just take a few minutes to introduce Carlene and the book, and we will get into some questions. So Carlene Hill Byron is a fundraiser and communicator for nonprofits that serve people with disabilities and other profound life challenges. She is the former editor of New England Church Life and the New England Christian, which are publications of Vision New England and the Evangelistic Association of New England. She is a spiritual wellness volunteer in the Maine Health Hospital System and is active in her Lutheran church. She has been medically treated for depression and bipolar disorder since the age of 19, with doctors attempting more than 20 different medications to contain her symptoms. She taught the National Alliance on Mental Illnesses Family to Family course for 8 years and spoke at the NAMI North Carolina State Conference about effective global alternatives to the US model of suicide prevention. You can find her online at The Mighty, Mad in America, the Redbud Post, and the Church and Mental Illness. Welcome, Carlene.
So good to be here with you all. Thank you.
Yes. I will just read a quick summary of the book as a starting place, and then I will turn it over to you, Carlene, to say a little bit more about the book in your words. But the book is called Not Quite Fine. Oh, you can't see it, it's blurred. Well, good enough. Mental Health, Faith, and Showing Up for One Another. At no other time in history or place in the world, there we go, have so many people understood themselves to be suffering from mental health problems. And at no other time or place in the world have people who are suffering been so readily ostracized. In Not Quite Fine, author Carlene Hill Byron tackles the mounting dilemmas that pastors and churches face around mental health. Medicines and therapies have their roles in supporting those who live with mental health problems or mental illness, but God's own body as the church is intended to be our greatest support in this world. How can the church step up for such a time as this? How can the body of Christ become a healing community for its members in pain, a place where the weary find strength for the journey, a place where those who mourn are raised up as rebuilders of the cities left in ruins? Drawing on her own history of mental health problems and her experience as a teacher and lay counselor, Byron offers words of hope for those who struggle, as well as practical insights to equip congregations to better support those who are suffering in their midst. I know that some who are joining today have already read Not Quite Fine, and some are joining today to learn more about the book or simply out of an interest in the topic of mental health and the church. All of you are welcome, whatever brings you here today. We're so glad you are here. You can purchase a copy of Not Quite Fine directly from Herald Press or wherever books are sold. We will also take time at the end to answer questions that any of you may have, so please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to add your questions. It's down at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your questions as you think of them anytime over the next hour, and we'll get to that, as many of them as we can near the end. So Carlene, it's so great to have you here today talking about your book. Why don't you start by telling us a bit more about what led you to write the book and anything else that is important for listeners to know before we dive into some other questions.
Fabulous. Well, as some folks who have looked at the book will know, and others may recognize pretty quickly, I have a lot of experience with people who have mental health struggles, and these are almost all in non-professional settings. So the first person I knew who died by suicide was my neighbor's, my classmate's dad, who was a neighbor of mine when I was like 10 years old. And there's my classmate's sister, my classmate's father, who died of suicide a few years later, and the two relatives that I've been in hospital with after their multiple attempts. And so I've just had a little bit more exposure than I think a lot of us have. And I'm actually kind of glad that most of you haven't had as much opportunity as I have to face these things. Um, in my own life, I have had, at this point, it's up to 6 different diagnoses and 22 different medications that have been attempted in 40 years of treatment. And,
Mhm.
at the risk of sounding really cynical, if they get to 5 or 6 meds and it's not working, the issue isn't the medicine. Really stop at that point. Um, Otherwise, you're just going to keep cycling. But that's just my point of view at this point. Um, so I had a lot of experience with people around me who are struggling. I had some struggles of my own. And I've also met some remarkable people who live with mental health challenges and are doing exceptional things. So, for
Mhm.
example, I have a relative with schizophrenia who worked for 20 years as a computer programmer back in the days when paternalistic employers were okay with having someone take 2 weeks off to go into hospital every 5 years or so, and then just come back to work and do their job. Um, he had to retire early when the workforce environment changed about
Mhm.
15 years ago. Have another friend also with schizophrenia, which is considered to be a very difficult to manage diagnosis,
Mhm.
who teaches yoga to veterans who have PTSD. And so, really, having even very difficult mental health diagnoses does not have to mean that a person is disabled.
Mhm.
However, we are at a point in our culture where that is what we believe. So
Mhm.
I think it's 40 years ago, 1 out of 750 adults in this country was on disability because of mental illness. Now it's 1 out of 70.
Mhm.
I mean, I
Wow.
can't even conceive that.
Mhm.
you know, I can't conceive that because it's just beyond me to imagine that we have managed to become that sick.
Mhm.
And so part of what got me into all of this is I've been writing about mental health for about 20 years in different contexts. I mean, a brochure that I wrote years and years ago is still on the website of Mental Health Ministries out in California, which is a Methodist ministry. Um,
Mhm.
And I've been watching the statistics go up and up. We used to say that 1 out of 4 households would be affected in some way by mental illness, usually perhaps in the person of a distant relative. And now we say 1 out of 2 people is
Mm.
going to experience a mental illness. That is a radically
Mhm.
different perspective on what it
Yes.
means to be mentally healthy or mentally ill. And so I'm watching all of this and going, wait a sec, what are we saying about what it is to be a healthy, capable, normal person? And most especially in the context that we live as people of God, what does it mean to be a person that God can use versus
Mhm.
a person who
Mhm.
has to be set on the side because they are so crippled by their
Mhm.
mental health conditions? So that's some of what was rattling around in my head when we first started talking, Menomedia and me.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, you make some really interesting points both now and in the book about where is this line between a diagnosable mental illness or mental health problem versus how we respond when we're in difficult circumstances. You wrote this book during the pandemic, which is kind of the pinnacle of unusual circumstances, and I think we've heard a lot about how this pandemic can bring about strains on our mental health in addition to threatening our physical health. That's been, I think, a topic of conversation since the very beginning of the pandemic. And you address that in chapter 2. I just going to read one little sentence here on page 47. You say, the mental illnesses we so feared during the coronavirus pandemic are likely to prove, by the time you're reading this, to have been mostly normal responses to abnormal circumstances. So tell us a little more about that, how an experience of anxiety or depression can sometimes be considered actually a normal response to an abnormal circumstance, whether that be living through the pandemic or some other stressful life situation.
Well, and I have to say, at this particular moment that we're conversing today, the abnormal situation that's most in front of most of us is what's happening in Ukraine. And
Yes.
so, is it normal for people to be undergoing remarkable
Mhm,
emotional difficulties in the face of
mhm,
this? I would say
mhm,
yes. To
mhm,
be, whether it's to be anxious that they themselves will have what they need, that they can provide for their children, that they can get safely out of the tunnels where they've been holed up for 2 months under a
mhm,
city.
mhm,
Um, Anxiety is the normal response to something like that. The question is how, once the circumstance has passed, do you manage to, I wouldn't even say to rebound back
mhm,
to the normal, but to absorb what you have learned from that into a wiser and stronger person. I find
mhm,
myself thinking a lot, and a number of the authors I read in working on this book were people who had survived the Holocaust.
mm,
And people who've survived the Holocaust, people who survived in prisoner of war camps during Vietnam,
mhm,
have a somewhat different perspective than our contemporary one about what's healthy and what's good enough. And, what matters is to be moving forward towards something that matters, not whether you happen to have some anxiety in your heart about it or whether you happen to still feel sad about some things that happened. Um, I
mhm,
think the most obvious example of, you know, an emotional state that's a normal response to an abnormal circumstance. Well, it's not an abnormal circumstance, but it's not in the course of our lifetime a constant
mhm,
circumstance, is grief, which,
mhm.
you know, even as little as 50 years ago, we understood that grief is a normal human reaction to an important
Mhm,
loss. And now, well, until the latest version of the DSM, our jobs let us
mm,
have 3 days to grieve, and the DSM gave
mhm,
us 2 weeks to feel sad before we could be diagnosed with clinical depression. The newest, this is so amazing. Just in the last couple of weeks, the transitional DSM has come out, and they have made prolonged grief its own kind of disorder. And so
mm.
here's some of the symptoms that they have for this disorder of prolonged grief. You feel like a part of yourself has died. You have a
Right.
sense of disbelief about the death. You avoid reminders that the person is dead. Now, I got to ask you, I mean, I'm old. I'm at the point where people die a lot around me, right? This sounds to me like the normal way to grieve. This doesn't sound to me like a
Absolutely.
disorder. And so
Absolutely.
it feels a lot like we're putting labels on stuff that is what it means to be human. This
Mhm,
isn't an illness, it's to be human.
mhm, mhm. And what would it say about us if we were able to, as you say, rebound within 2 weeks from a major loss? It's just it's not the way we are as human beings. This makes me think
Unless we
about
really didn't like that person, in which case, hey,
right.
you know.
This makes me think about some cultural differences. And when you mentioned grief, I'm just thinking about some cultures really do process grief differently. And I think what you're speaking to is how American culture, I should say mainstream American, maybe Canadian culture, pushes us in a different direction. So you talk a lot about culture in chapter 2, which is called How Culture Undermines Mental Health, and specifically getting into different cultural elements that are contributing to this rise in loneliness and depression and anxiety. And one of the phrases that you use in that chapter that stood out to me is poverty of affluence, which is a phrase drawn from Mother Teresa. So, what is poverty of affluence, and how does that affect mental health?
Well, and I want to put that phrase in context. That
Mhm,
came from a conversation that Mother Teresa had with a Boston businessman who,
mhm,
with his wife, had gone to Calcutta thinking that they would invest their retirement with the Missionaries of Charity.
mhm,
And Frank says, Mother Teresa put her hand on my knee and said to me, Frank, go back to America. In America, there is a loneliness in the poverty of affluence that is unequaled anywhere in the world.
Mhm.
And that was, you know, one of those turning point moments for his life. And he became involved in a lot. He had always been involved in a lot of significant service work in the States, but became more focused on issues related to the loneliness of affluent people because he had retired
Mhm.
as chairman of Kodak's Eastman Gelatin film division. So he was a pretty high powered guy
Mhm.
professionally, but a very gracious and humble person in his faith life. When I think about what the poverty of affluence looks like, some of what I think about is the conviviality and even joy that we often observe if we have the opportunity to travel internationally to countries that are less wealthy.
Mhm.
Kids who have no sports equipment are playing soccer with several rolled up socks and
Mhm.
are having much more fun than the kids that we just drove 4 hours to their travel team game, right?
Mhm.
Um, so there's a piece of conviviality and joy that is often evident when there is less affluence, and I'll go into it some of my speculations about what's going on.
Mhm.
We do become increasingly isolated from other people as we become more affluent, and
Mhm.
that happens in some ways that are structural. We are able to afford individual housing. So our parents and our grandparents and our children are less likely to live with us. That's reversing a bit now. And that would be for our good, in my rarely humble opinion. um, but another thing is that affluence removes a lot of the things that tie communities together. It's kind of funny because God likes to supply our need through each other.
Mhm.
And you can look at, you know, communities 50 and 100 and 150 years ago and see the ways that people were bound together in relationship by their need, by their need to borrow tools, by the need to share clothing for their kids,
Mhm.
by something as simple as not hiring a pet sitter, but asking the neighbor's kid to walk the dog for you. Um,
Mhm.
in my own family history, I think of family members in Colorado at near the turn of the last century, um, who had been living in a multi-generational family farm, but the
Mhm.
farm got on, you know, the kind of firm footing that allowed them to say, well, what else does my community need? So the sons and some hired hands managed the farm, and dad and mom and the girls moved into town and started the first pharmacy for that community.
Mm.
And so the community's needs were bound together through people's working together on behalf of their community in a way that
Mhm.
is much less likely to happen now. I mean, if you need a pharmacy, somebody protests until somebody puts a pharmacy there, or you live in a pharmacy desert, I guess. But you know what I'm
Mhm.
saying.
Mhm.
But I mean, I think more profoundly, when we are so financially independent, we're not in contact with other people's need, and that makes it
Mhm.
much more difficult for us to empathetically support other people in their needs. And here I think about, now my mother went to a one-room rural school, which is actually like 4 miles from where I'm sitting now. Um,
Mm.
and in that one-room school, because my mom was bright, she got
Mhm.
through her stuff quickly and then was enlisted to help support the kids who were not so quick. And the implicit lesson there is that we are together responsible for our group progress. We
Mhm.
can help each other get ahead. I
Mhm.
mean, there was also great leadership lessons. She ended up being president of every club she was in high school. But that was because there was that community of need. that she was part
Mhm.
of, that she learned some of those skills. I
Mhm.
think it's also true that in affluent settings, we presume that a lot of things are possible that goes
Mm.
beyond what actually is possible, but ties us up in a lot of anxiety and guilt over our failures and um, envy of other people's achievements.
Mhm.
Um, I was in a meeting yesterday where a local high school teacher and student were guests. And the student was asked specifically why he thought kids were having so many mental health problems. And this is a capable kid. I mean, he was in our
Mhm.
meeting because we were supporting him for a foreign exchange to Europe
Mhm.
over the
Mhm.
summer. Um, and he said, the thing is, if you're not building a Harvard resume, you're not doing enough. But if everyone around you is building a Harvard resume, if everybody has got a 4.0 average and 10 extracurriculars and varsity sports in 3 seasons and,
Mhm.
goes overseas on a nonprofit service tour, eh, who's good enough? Nobody's
Mhm.
good enough. Um, I find myself, it's funny, I have so many old things around. I'm an old person. So I've got this wonderful hutch in my dining room, which was built by someone for his wife.
Mhm.
And it's only 2 generations. It's,
Mm.
just past my lifetime that we stopped just doing those kinds of things in our
Mhm.
normal life.
Mhm.
Knowing that we could be competent to create something that was important to me and the people around me instead
Mm.
of only allowing ourselves to be competent either at Harvard or in our job, which has to escalate so we make more money so we can buy more stuff.
Mhm. Mhm.
And all that's a very unrooted and unsatisfying way of life. And,
Mhm.
one of the things that journalist Johan Hari has found as he reviewed just research worldwide is that the wealthier you are, the more anxious and the more depressed you are as a nation.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's a long riff. I'm sorry about
Yeah.
that.
No, no, not at all. Lots of interesting stuff to think about. You raised some interesting points about how we, in order to help each other and or be in position to help each other, we have to be in this close knit relationship and community and even be at a place of needing help for to be able to step in and provide that for one another. In the book, you talk about what that looks like in different types of communities and specifically in church or congregational settings. And chapter 3 talks about how, those of us who are not trained as mental health professionals might feel nervous about our ability to really be helpful when someone is dealing with a mental health problem. But as you say at the start of the chapter, congregations are on the front lines where mental health problems are concerned. So you go on to talk about, different ways that the typical churchgoer can be helpful in providing mental health support, and kind of complementing the professional or medical care that the person is also receiving. So I wonder if you could talk about that specifically in a church setting and maybe give some
Mhm.
examples of what that would look like or could look like.
I think I would reference a couple of things. One is just consistency of relationship. And
Mm.
I do talk in the book about having had a prayer partner that I prayed with every Wednesday night. And so even when one of my meds caused a delusion that God was
Mhm.
evil and the Bible was full of lies,
Mhm.
she'd been praying with me every week at that point for like,
Mhm.
I don't know, 18 months, 2 years, and could just say, you haven't always believed this. I don't think you are always going to believe this, but while you do, just let me
Mhm.
pray for you. You don't have to pray.
Mhm. Mhm.
And consistency like that, and in that particular case, consistency in being in the presence of God together is a really remarkable support, even in very difficult mental health circumstances, as I was in at that time. Now,
Mhm.
right now, one of my best mental health supports, and if there's any other Lutherans in the room, you'll recognize this, church choir. I mean, there's all kinds of science about what music does to help our mental health. But the other thing about my choir is this is a group of people, again, that I gather with consistently twice a week, rehearsal and Sunday morning. And they're just lighthearted and easygoing, and we have a good time together. And for me, as a person whose social skills are, I'm not the life of the party, you know? I mean, so to be able to be in a setting where I get to experience that party around me sort of helps to tune me to what that feels like, which
Mhm.
helps me to get myself into that better place. So that's
Mhm.
that's a couple of examples of the way I've experienced church mental health support. I mean, we hear all the time, and it's a point well taken, that mental illness is the only casserole-free illness in a church. And really, you know, there's not a good reason to be more scared to bring me a meal than somebody who's had a heart attack. But
Mhm.
there does seem to be this unspoken boundary around that, which is unfortunate.
Mhm.
Household help, we had a gal years ago who had such severe OCD that her house was just, I mean, she had 3 or 4
Mhm.
kids, and the house was just piled because her OCD caused her, as one example, to create such rules around her laundry that she really couldn't sort
Mhm.
it, because she could
Mhm.
only wash the blue things in one load and the green things in one load. But what does that mean she does with a blue and green striped shirt? She
Right.
just was so bound up in her rules. And for us to be able to come in and go through the house and get
Mm.
things in order really made a lot of difference.
Mm.
Um, so those are a few things. People may
Yeah.
have more questions or whatever.
Yeah, I love that about consistency of relationship and the ways we can then be led into really showing up in not just a superficial way, but in ways that are very impactful, especially in the difficult moments. I want to follow up on that, but first let's just give a couple reminders in case anyone has just joined us. Um, I'm talking with Carlene Hill Byron, who's author of the Herald Press book, Not Quite Fine, Mental Health, Faith, and Showing Up for One Another. You can purchase a copy of Not Quite Fine from Herald Press or wherever books are sold. And also remember that we will have time for listener questions at the end. So as you're listening and thinking of questions, feel free to go ahead at any time and just type them into the Q&A feature in Zoom there at the bottom of your screen, and we will see how many we can get to at the end. So on this theme of belonging and being in relationship, I was really especially interested in that chapter on belonging because I just think that that is so crucial to how we function as human beings, the ways we interact with the world around us, and what we need to thrive. And so in that chapter, you talk about kind of the first time that you felt yourself a strong sense of belonging, and that was not in a church; it was at your Rotary Club. You already kind of touched on what it feels like to belong, but I wonder if you can talk about that experience and what it felt like to belong for the first time, and then how that helped you as you went on to seek out and find a church home once you knew what it felt like to belong somewhere.
Great question. So I will say that the Rotary Club that I belong to is a really old line club, really traditional meeting. I mean, if any of us would go there, we'd recognize immediately that it's structured like a liturgy. You come in, you have a welcome, you have the announcements, you have the testimonies, which we call happy dollars. You have you have a song, and then you have the speaker of the day. It's structured like going to church,
Mhm.
which is kind of funny.
That's
But
interesting.
it wasn't the liturgical structure that helped me feel like I belonged there. It was the fact that I could come in every week and sit down at a table and people would talk with me. They didn't turn
Mhm.
and talk to the other person. They would include me in the
Mhm.
conversation. And I could hear an announcement about a project and participate in it. And
Mhm.
there were enough kinds of projects that there were actually projects that used real gifts I have. So, for
Mhm.
example, in church over 30 years to that point, I mostly served in the nursery. And
Mhm.
I'm embarrassed to say that childcare is not one of my great strengths. And childcare that's designed to keep them focused on the video is really not one of my
Uh-huh.
strengths. Um, so in Rotary, whether it was a community cleanup, a landscaping project in a
Mhm.
public park, um, writing the local history brochure. I mean, these are
Mhm.
things that where the person that God has made me to be was being valued.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I started to experience in that context that, the place where you belong is the place where people see you and include
Mhm.
you and value the person you are.
Mhm.
And that was not something I had largely experienced in churches where, and I'm sorry, this may offend some of the people listening, um, in churches where the only route to leadership for a woman is to be a married mother with children.
Mhm.
Because even being married to an elder wasn't enough.
Mm.
So that
Yeah.
was, that was what I experienced in Rotary. And that helped me to recognize that the church that I was going to, where there were no opportunities to serve, and where even going to Sunday worship, Wednesday prayer meeting, Thursday small group, um, there was something else in there, I forget. It was very busy, but
Mhm.
never had a chance to be seen, to be
Mhm.
invited. I think it was when I
Mhm.
finally got to the point where I didn't have any place to go for Thanksgiving dinner again. And
Mm.
the leader of the small group program just kind of said, "Well, are you going to a small group?" And it's like, yeah, I was going to two of them at that point. And if the
Mhm.
small groups aren't helping to make sure that people actually have a place to spend their holiday meals, this isn't a place where people are being encouraged to belong. You know, this is
Right.
just a place where the families brush edges against each other on Sunday morning. So
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think we've all probably experienced that feeling of I belong here and that feeling of I feel like an outsider here. And it's really like night and day, the difference between those two things. And that's so vital for us to think about in our congregations. And I think that's an interesting point too about the activities and projects that we provide in a congregational setting and thinking about it as not just trying to get something done, but also just providing a venue for people to connect. I mean, that's at least as important as whatever the actual project is in some sense. So yeah, thank you.
yeah.
Um, I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about chapter 7, which is where you talk about the differences between feelings versus thoughts versus situations, because, of course, this also plays out in congregations and everywhere that the people show up. It seems clear from that chapter that understanding our feelings better is so important to process those feelings in a healthy way. So, just to give an example, you're kind of unpacking this on page 135. This is a chapter called Finding Feelings, Finding Hope. I'll just read a little bit. You say, recognizing the difference between feelings and situations is one way we help ourselves and others take appropriate responsibility when change is needed. So, for instance, lonely is a feeling, isolated is a situation we have power to change. Loved is a feeling, cared for is a situation that generally demands not just God's care, but the caring hands of God's people. So, I'm just wondering what advice you would give to people who are reading this, thinking about this, and wanting to deepen their own emotional intelligence or their awareness of their own feelings. What do you think is a good starting place in just starting to develop that daily awareness of what we're feeling and what it means for everything else in our life?
Wow, that's not a small question, is it? Um, and there's a part of me thinks that I might not be the best person to give individuals guidance on How do
Mhm.
you do that? Simply because I have been in professional therapy for 40 years.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I've had so much chance to examine things.
Right.
People
Right.
frequently tell me that I am like the most self-aware person they've ever met, which doesn't mean I'm the most emotionally competent person they've ever met. It just means I'm
Sure.
self-aware, which is a different thing.
Sure.
Um, my observation is at this point in my life is that a good coach
Mhm.
is much more useful than a therapist in unpacking in helpful ways,
Hmm.
because a coach is someone who is focused on helping you step into your strengths and work through your challenges. Um, and that allows you the freedom to say, I'm terrified about taking on X, and to unpack what are the thoughts about it, how much of it is just physiological response and what can you do about that,
Mhm.
um, how much of it is, you know, bad memories of similar experiences that you have an opportunity at this moment to let go. um, right now at the point I'm at, I'm actually finding that some of the most helpful material for discerning all this stuff within a faith framework is materials on spiritual direction from the Orthodox Christian traditions,
Hmm.
because they've been working on this stuff for 2 millennia.
Right.
You know, they're not busy running around trying to order demons out or trying to tell you if you just recite these 17 scripture verses, you'll be fine. They've actually had some time to work this out.
Right.
Seems pretty helpful. Um,
Hmm.
but that's been that's where I am right now.
Hmm. Hmm. In chapters 8 and 9, these are both called the Competent Caregiver's Toolkit, and they focus on humility in chapter 8 and fearlessness in chapter 9. So, why did you choose humility and fearlessness as two of the most important qualities for a caregiver of someone experiencing mental health problems?
Well, I'd say first fearlessness. I mean, when you're facing somebody who you don't even begin to understand what they're saying, doing, thinking,
Hmm.
you've got to be able to be unafraid to even
Hmm.
be there with them. And
Hmm.
for many of us, the easy way in on that is going to be dementia care. We
Hmm.
have a lot of opportunities among older adults to spend time with folks who just aren't really in the same world that we are. And that's a good
Hmm.
practice place for being fearless with somebody who's living in a different space. Because I think that's what
Hmm.
most of the fear is really about, not understanding and not
Hmm.
knowing what to do and imagining that if you do something wrong, like the world's going to explode and they're going to become a serial killer, which is
Right.
like really not very probable at all.
Uh-huh.
Humility, this really comes to me around the way that we are trying to make everybody, including our congregational caregivers, into quasi professionals in mental health care,
Hmm.
especially in the suicide prevention universe. We've got
Hmm.
more than 5 million lay people trained in suicide prevention strategies right now. That's like 1 out of 200 of us or something. It's crazy.
Hmm.
Um, and, you know, I've and I'd lost a friend to suicide, that a roommate that nobody had a clue. In the same way that when Robin Williams died of suicide, nobody
Hmm.
had a clue.
Hmm.
And we need to be humble enough to acknowledge that this might be a bigger problem than we can solve, but that doesn't mean we cannot be a helper simply by
Hmm.
being present and being kind and sharing a person's life. And it means being humble enough to know that doing all those things, he still could fail, till he
Mhm.
died. Um,
Mhm.
and that happens, and you have to allow that it will.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think that middle ground is so important between, on the one extreme, not wanting to try to help at all because you're too afraid of you're too nervous about your own inability or whatever it might be, on that one extreme versus on the other extreme, thinking that you can handle it all yourself. And so I think you do address that in different parts of the book with that earlier chapter that talks about, I don't feel qualified to help. What do I do? And then at the end of the book, the final chapter is, when should a caregiver ask for help? So I think what you're speaking to is a good reminder for all of us that we do have a place in this space, and there's some guidance here for how to navigate that, and then recognizing too when you're at a place where you need to bring in some other experts.
Mhm.
Um, I'm still not seeing questions coming in yet, so I will encourage you to add your questions if you have them. In the meantime, I'll ask one final question. Carlene, why don't you just tell us a bit about your vision and your hopes for what happens after people read this book? How does that impact our congregations? How do we carry this advice into our own lives, or any other words of encouragement that you want to share?
Well, my hope for congregations is that uh, I'm going to really offend somebody when I say this. My hope is that congregations will begin to shut down their mental health ministries, because what I feel like I'm seeing happen, and what I feel like I was experiencing when I was in a congregation large enough to have it, is that we were not part of the congregation, we were part of the mental health ministry. And
Mhm.
so, for example, not myself, but if someone was a gifted singer and wanted to sing worship music, well, you can sing worship music in the mental health congregation. Not you can be on the worship team, or at least even audition for the worship team. And I think it's really problematic when congregations structure themselves around the idea that the people who have mental illness should be in a specialized ministry for them,
Mhm.
versus being part of the body of Christ, all of us looking out for one another. In part, that tells us that we have nothing to offer to people except other people with mental illnesses, which is not true. I can just guarantee that.
Mhm.
Um, in in some ways, it almost feels like the congregation is saying, you know, because your toe is smashed, we don't need your hand, you know?
Right.
And that really weakens the body when we behave that way. Um, so I'd love to see the mental health, the specialized mental health ministries close down. I'm sorry, I need to introduce Irish to you, so he will go away. This is Irish. Hello. Okay.
Hello.
Um, so I'd like to see the specialized mental health ministries go away. I'd like to see the pressure on pastors and leaders to become mental health experts go away. One of the one of the this is a small example, but I hear over and over congregations being encouraged to establish a mental health referral list. Well, here's the thing about a referral list in the US context. In Canada, it might be a little different, but in the
Mhm.
US context, if you make a referral list, then the person you give it to has an insurance plan, and they have to start going through these to see whether any of these are on their insurance network. And the insurance
Mm.
networks change every year. so, so what you've done is not given people a referral list, but given them a project, which, because they are emotionally compromised at that moment, they have limited capacity to accomplish. I think it's much more valuable for congregations to focus on how they're going to support the person as they go through that process.
Mhm.
Um, and likewise, how they're going to support the person as they go through the process of being treated and taking medications that may work, may not work, may create dramatic effects that are not related to their illness. Those are all really challenging experiences that a congregation can walk with a person through, even when the pastoral leadership and the congregational leadership is not expert, because people with mental health challenges need and deserve pastoral care.
Mm-hmm.
And we have spiritual concerns. I tell a story in the book that I heard from a Salvation Army officer I knew about the crazy guy. I mean, you've all seen him in your Sunday night services, plops himself in the front row, and as soon as the pastor starts speaking, he starts raising his hand with questions. And Pete took the first two questions and then helped the guy recognize that there were all these people around who had come to hear the talk. And so if he could be willing to hold his questions, Pete would talk with him afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And turned out when they went back to his office, I mean, this guy would be diagnosably psychotic. He believed he had a mind meld with aliens, and the aliens in his brain wanted to know if Jesus died for them too. Well, that's not a psychiatric problem. That's a spiritual problem.
Mm-hmm.
And Pete thought it through. Well, Jesus died once for all, and he's the God of all the universe. So yes, he died for the aliens in your brain.
Mm-hmm.
And he did not need to assess for an instant the mental health condition to treat the spiritual condition. The guy jumped up and said, that's what they wanted to know, and walked out happy.
That's it.
So I think, we all, as we have some pastoral skills and some real understanding of the spiritual needs we can reach into, whether through conversation or through prayer or just being hand in hand with someone, we can do good mental health ministry without knowing much of anything about the diagnostic systems and the potential medical treatments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great points. I think you've really given us a lot to think about and a lot of good tangible ways to bring this back to our congregations or just to our other circles, our families, whoever we interact with. I do have a question here from someone who's listening. What is your opinion on mental health support groups in the church where people with mental health challenges can come together with others who have similar challenges?
I have actually mixed opinions about those, and so I'm going to moderate some of what I've been saying. There are some mental health support group programs that have been developed by folks who have mental illnesses. I think particularly of Fresh Hope that was developed by Brad Hofs, who is a pastor who has bipolar disorder. And one of the things that is really different about the structure and even the language of that program compared with most of the other church-based mental health programs I've observed is that he talks about people with mental health challenges and their loved ones, actually our loved ones, whereas most programs are about us and our loved ones with mental illness, which others us
Right.
and increases our experience of exclusion. So I love programs that are that really center on the experience of people with mental health challenges. The best support group I ever went to when I lived in North Carolina was a bipolar support group that was all people with bipolar leading it for each other. It wasn't through any organization. It was just the Triangle Bipolar Bears, and most of us were professional people. And had to deal with our challenges in the context of jobs and everything else. And nobody was
Mhm.
there telling us, you've got a really difficult situation and should take as much time off from work as you want, to deal
Mhm.
with it. Like, no,
Mhm.
I have to go to work. I have to pay my
Mhm.
bills. So what do I
Mhm.
do next?
Right.
So strong preference for groups that are peer-led, um, versus peer-led, peer-organized versus designed by people who don't have mental health challenges in the way
Mhm.
they think will support people who have mental health challenges.
Mhm. Yeah, that's good. Makes sense. Someone else is asking, what about a situation where someone with a mental health problem is employed by the congregation and maybe struggling to get their work done? Where is the balance in setting boundaries of things that need to get done versus allowing space for that mental health problem?
I am not a denominational leader or a congregational manager. So um, I think about this just as an employment situation.
Mhm.
If the congregation has employed a person to do certain things and those things can't be done, it's a workplace management issue.
Mhm.
That does not mean that the congregation wouldn't provide pastoral care and
Mhm.
support.
Mhm.
And I think you'd have to sort it out in the context of how your congregation would handle someone who is long-term grieving or who's on
Mhm.
staff or who's out 6 weeks because of a heart attack and
Mhm.
is still eating sacks of potato chips. I mean, I don't know.
Mhm.
Um, I'm not wise on that one, and I would encourage you to talk with some other peers in pastoral leadership about that one.
Mhm. Thanks. Any other final questions from listeners as we're here live? All right. Well, thank you so much, Carlene, for participating in this conversation today. We really appreciate your time and your insights. I think this has been a great way of getting us all thinking in new ways about the book and hopefully inspiring some people to pick up the book and read it. So I encourage everyone who's here tonight or watching after the fact that to get your own copy of Not Quite Fine and just continue engaging with this intersection of mental health and faith. Copies of the book are available directly from Herald Press or wherever else books are sold. Again,
And if
thank
you're
you so
getting it
much,
for the common
Carlene.
read, you can get multiple copies at a discount, right?
That's right. Yes. And yeah, we would love to continue this conversation and expanding readership of this book and other resources on mental health and faith. Again, thank you so much to Carlene for your powerful words, and thank you to all of you who have joined us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you all.
Bye.